And in this module, we're going to take a closer look at the Razor views that our application uses to render HTML to the browser. We've already learned a bit about Razor views and HTML helpers and where views are located, but there's still a few more details you should know for day-to-day development. For example, if I come over into Visual Studio, let's open up the index view for the restaurants controller. So this is the view that renders the list of restaurants for the user to see. And you already know that @model is a directive, so this is more of an instruction for the compilers and the tools to know that this view is going to work with a collection, an IEnumerable of restaurant. That's the model. And then model, with an uppercase M, is the model property of this view. This gives me access to the model object that the controller has built for this view. And I can access that property inside of a statement or inside of an expression. So when using the @ sign and writing C# code that includes an opening curly brace, I'm really creating a block of C# code, and I need to write proper statements inside of that block. So an example would be up here at the top. This is a block of C# code. This can be full of many statements. In fact, I can even declare variables inside of here and say x equals 2 plus 3. And I need to end every statement with a semicolon, just like I would if I was writing regular C# code inside of a .cs file. But I can also use the @ sign to create an expression, so something like @model.count, which is not a full statement. All I want to do is write out the number of restaurants that I know about. So @model with an uppercase M, again, is accessing the property of this view. So I am working with an IEnumerable of restaurant here, and the syntax is telling the Razor View Engine, evaluate this expression, model.count, and place the result as a string into the output. So the number 2 or the number 1 or the number 10 or the number 100, however many restaurants we have, should appear right at this location after the closing H2 tag and before this opening paragraph tag. This goes right into the output stream. And anything that you do in Razor by default will be HTML encoded to help prevent cross-site scripting attacks. If that's not something you want to do, if you want to have some expression or take some value or some string and send that into your output without HTML encoding, one way to do that is to use an HTML helper, the raw helper. So inside of here, I can have a string that includes HTML markup, and it will render HTML into the output stream. But you have to be careful with that one because of cross-site scripting attacks. Now, we've already seen in this course, when I have an @ sign and I'm writing a C# statement that has an opening curly brace, then just like in a regular C# file, I need to match that with a closing curly brace somewhere. And in between, I can have statements and expressions, but you'll notice how easy it is for Razor to transition between C# mode and HTML mode. Basically, when Razor gets to this character right here, it doesn't treat it as a C# less than operator. It treats this as a hunk of HTML that has to be emitted as is back to the client. And that's just some intelligence or heuristics that are built into the Razor parser, but they don't always work. If I wanted literal text to appear here, so I'm going to have something inside of a for each loop that is not immediately an HTML element. If I just want to write out some text, well, that was going to be a bit of a problem because the Razor View Engine is going to think I'm still writing some C# code. And it's going to go looking for a namespace or a variable or something named text, and it's not going to find that. If you ever find yourself in that situation, you can use the @ sign and a colon, which is another way of telling Razor, this is a bit of static text that needs to be sent down to the client in the output. So render this into the HTML. You can also run into some other edge circumstances with the @ sign. So for example, what if you wanted to output an email address right here? So I want to write scott@odecode.com. And the question is, will the Razor View Engine interpret @odecode as some bit of C# code? And the answer is, if we run this application, and I pull the new window over here onto the screen, then no, it turns out there's a special case in the Razor View Engine where Razor will recognize an email address. So something of the form text at something. Razor will think of that as an email address and not try to interpret the @ sign as switching into C# mode. But what if I wanted to write out my Twitter handle? So what if I wanted to write @odecode? So the syntax highlighting inside of Visual Studio is going to give this one away in that Razor is going to try to interpret that as a C# expression that needs to be rendered. And because this name odecode doesn't exist in the current context, I'm going to have a compilation error. However, I can escape the @ sign. So anytime I write @ and then have some expression, Razor will say, oh, you must want to output literally the @ sign. So that's how I can output a Twitter address. And what if I had some situation like I wanted to output scott@odecode.com and then something off the model. So let's say I wanted to say scott@odecode.com and then some number like 1 or 10 or something that was derived from my model for whatever reason, but obviously Razor has already determined that this is some sort of email address, so it's not going to evaluate model.count as an expression. However, anytime you're faced with that situation, if you use the @ sign and then place your expression inside of parentheses, like I have just done here, that's an explicit way to tell the Razor View Engine, I want this treated as an expression. So please evaluate model.count and place that result into the output. So now I can have the number 1 because we only have one restaurant in our list. And these are some of the little details about Razor that I wanted to share with you to hopefully make your day-to-day experience with Razor a little bit better. And now let's go into some larger topics about Razor. Like for example, how does the view that I'm writing, the index view, how does it automatically plug into the layout view, which controls the rest of the markup that we see appearing here? For example, the menu for the application. How does that work? We'll talk about that next. So what is it about this index view that allows this view and this markup to render inside of some larger view that also presents an application menu and a header and a footer and so forth? Well, ultimately, what has to happen is that someone has to set the layout property of this particular view. So just like every view has a model property that I can use to access the model object, I also have a layout property that I can set to tell the MVC framework and the Razor View Engine what layout view do I want to use. So before we set that, let's also clean up this experiment a bit. I'm just going to remove that bit of code. And then I'm going to say that I want to set the layout property to, let's just use something called _testlayout.cshtml. So is this a file that exists in the application? No, this file does not exist. But when I come back and I refresh the browser, we'll see that this is the layout page that our index view now wanted to use. But the MVC View Engine will throw an exception and tell us that views/restaurants/_testlayout.cshtml is not a file and it's not a layout page that I could locate. Thus, we're just going to throw an exception. So by setting this layout property, you have complete control over the layout view that this index view is going to use. So I can remove this line of code, and clearly something is setting that layout property by default, because now I'm using a layout view that we've looked at before, the layout view that is in the shared folder. But before we look at the little bit of magic that makes that work, I also just want you to know that you can explicitly set the layout view inside of a regular view if you want to override the magical default for your project. In fact, you can say layout equals null, which is a way of telling the Razor View Engine, I want to render this view without using any layout page. So now we have just the output from our Razor view. This can be very helpful for those applications that are using a lot of client-side JavaScript, and you don't want a full HTML page to come back from the server. You just want pieces and fragments of HTML that represent the bits that need to be updated on the screen. And this is what our index view would look like if it wasn't plugging into a layout view. So not only is there no menu, there's no header, there's no footer, there's also no CSS file. So there's no Bootstrap framework, which makes this HTML markup appear and render very differently in the browser. But coming back to Visual Studio, if I remove this line that says layout equals null, so I take the default layout page for my application, that's going to be the layout page that is in the shared folder. How does that happen? That's the topic for the next clip. Inside of our application, inside of the views folder, one of the files you might have noticed inside of this folder is the _viewstart.cshtml file. This file is interesting because it doesn't contain any HTML markup. It simply contains a single C# statement that says layout equals. And it is this file that is responsible for setting the layout view, the default layout view, for all the other views in the application. So _viewstart.cshtml is a special file that the Razor View Engine will go looking for. And any code that you place inside of _viewstart.cshtml in this code block will effectively execute before the code blocks inside of your Razor views. So think about it this way. When the restaurant's controller says, go render the index.cshtml view, yes, the Razor View Engine will find index.cshtml here, but before it starts executing that particular view, it will first execute the code inside of any view start file that it can find in that folder or any parent folder. So a view start file is very hierarchical. when you place it into a folder and here it is inside of the views folder, it will effectively apply to all of the folders and all of the views inside of those subfolders beneath it. So in other words, I could have also had a special view start file inside of just the restaurants folder or the greeting folder. But this bit of code will execute to say, set the layout property for this particular view to underscore layout.cshtml. And then the Razor View Engine can go in and start to execute the index view. And the index view, if it has a layout statement here, that might be overriding what the view start is doing. So we did see earlier that I can set the layout to null. But because view start gets to execute before my view, that gives me a nice default setting where I will use this underscore layout file unless I specify otherwise. So this bit of code applies to all the views, and I don't have to have this bit of code inside of every single view inside of the application. And that's how we can effectively have a default layout view of underscore layout.cshtml. Let's look at the layout view that we are using, underscore layout.cshtml in the shared folder. This layout view will contain, like most layout views, the HTML structure that every web page needs to put in place in order to be a valid HTML document. So for example, it is the layout page that can take care of setting the doc type. And it's the layout page that can take care of the head tag for our HTML document. And our head tag is going to contain things like the common style sheets that we use all throughout the application, as well as meta tags to set the character set, as well as the viewport. And then there's an interesting bit right here where the layout page wants to set the title for the page. So this is interesting because every view in the system is going to want to set its own title. So how does a view like index.cshtml provide the title information for the layout page, which is actually responsible for rendering the title tag and setting the title in the browser? Well, in ASP.NET MVC, this is done through a data structure known as the view bag. View bag is a property, just like layout and model, that I can access inside of a layout view or inside of a regular view. In fact, if we open up index.cshtml, we will also see the view bag property that is being accessed here. And view bag, if I hover over this, you'll see it is of type dynamic. So this is a dynamically typed property that I have available for my view. And because it's dynamically typed, I can basically treat view bag like a dictionary of key value pairs. So anything that I want to add into the view bag, I can add into the view bag. And anything I want to retrieve from the view bag, I can just ask for it by using the dot operator and trying to get into the view bag. So for example, I could say view bag dot message equals hello. And then somewhere else in the system, like for example, inside of the layout view, I can try to access that message. So down here, I can say viewbag.message. So somewhere in the body of this layout page, somewhere inside of our div that contains our container. And now if I come back to the browser and refresh, you can see the hello appear down here. So I have effectively transmitted some data from my content view, which is index.cshtml, into my layout view, which is underscore layout.cshtml. Of course, my layout view has to be a little bit careful because not every view in this application is providing a message property on viewbag. But for right now, I just want you to focus on the larger picture, which is viewbag is this dictionary of items where I can just throw things in and pull them out somewhere else, like inside of the layout view. So why do we use the viewbag to set the title for our web page? Well, because I am sharing the same view bag between this layout view as I have in my index view. That's pretty clear from the demo that I just showed where I showed you the message. But why couldn't we have, let's say, for example, a title property? Why can I not say @model.title? Well, I can access the model property of a view from the layout view. The problem is, inside of this layout view, I have no idea what the underlying model is going to be because the model object is going to be different for all these different views that are inside of the restaurants folder. So with the index view, the model is an IEnumerable of restaurant. For the details view, the model is a single restaurant. And my layout view has to work with all those different types of views. So instead of trying to work with a model object and perhaps coming up with some base class that represents all the models in the system, ASP.NET MVC makes passing information between a regular view and a layout view really easy by providing this viewbag data structure. And so viewbag is one technique you can use when your layout view needs to display or render something specific to a view. So this is the title that is specific to the index view, but it does this in a way where the layout view doesn't become coupled to the index view. So we're just going to output whatever is in viewbag.title, and any view in the system has the ability to set that property on the dynamic view bag. Somewhere inside of every layout view, you will find a call to the method renderBody. This is the point where the Razor View Engine knows to render the primary content view that was requested by the controller. So when the controller says, please render the index view, and the index view, either through view start or through its own block of code, says render the layout view, then the Razor View Engine starts building this HTML to send down to the client. And when it finds renderBody, that's when it will essentially jump back into the index view, produce all the HTML that the index view requires, and all of this dynamic output will be placed here where we have the call to renderBody. We've seen how this works throughout the application. Every time we create a new view, whether it's a delete view or a details view or an edit view, we only need to write the HTML that is specific to that feature, and the layout view takes care of building the rest of the page. But what happens if we have a view that wants to plug in more than just the body of the content? So perhaps we have a view that wants to customize not only the body content area that is inside of this div, but let's say it also wants to plug something into the footer area. Or perhaps I have a view that includes some custom JavaScript, and I want to render that JavaScript as late as possible in the page, so right before the closing body element. And right here after the layout page has placed some other script files into the page. So this script helper helps me render script tags so that I can place jQuery into the page and Bootstrap into the page. And then you'll see this call to render section. So it is render section that will allow me to perform this behavior where I can define additional sections inside of this layout view that the content view can render into. So for example, imagine I have an application where some of the views in this application need to render a custom footer, or they need to place additional information into this footer. If that's the case, I can invoke the method renderSection. I will pass in the name of the section. Let's name this section the footer area, and then I can make this a required section or an optional section. So I'm going to say required is false, because currently there are no views inside of this application that have a footer section defined. So now when I do have one of those views that wants to place something here into the structure of the page, into the footer section, how do I produce the output that appears here? Well, let's save the layout view and come over to the index view. And somewhere inside of the index view, it can be at the beginning or at the bottom or somewhere in the middle, I can use the @section directive to tell the MVC View Engine, now what I want to do is render the following bit into the footer of the layout view. So let's just have some simple markup inside of a div tag that says this is a custom footer. And now when I save all of my files and come back to the browser, come back to the application and refresh, my content view will render all of its content where I have the render body call in the layout view, except for the section that is the footer section that renders inside of that footer section. So coming back to Visual Studio, the section directive and the render section method can work together so that your layout page can define a very flexible structure that allows your content views to plug in at different areas. One way to think about the layout view is to think of it as a view that allows you to reuse HTML, because once I have a head element defined inside of one of my layout views, I never need to use or duplicate or copy and paste that head element and all of its content into any other view inside of the application. It's just that the layout view also allows me to reuse structure in addition to markup. So the structure I defined with render body and render section is something that will be reused throughout the application because all my other views have to plug into that structure that I define. So this is one form of reuse, but inside of an application, typically you're going to have other scenarios where you want to reuse some of your markup. So let's take this example. Let's go over into index.cshtml, where we render our collection of restaurants into a table of restaurant information. But first of all, let's say I want to change this. Let's say instead of using a table, I just want to have a series of Bootstrap panels. So if you're not familiar with Bootstrap, if you don't know what a Bootstrap panel is, trust me, it will be very simple. We're just going to have some slightly different markup. And instead of using a table, we're going to be using divs that have special classes. But it's going to be very easy to use. The bigger picture here, what I really want you to focus on, is that what we really want to do is we want to define what a restaurant summary should look like. So throughout the application, we might have various places where we want to display summary information about a restaurant, like display the restaurant name. In addition, alongside the restaurant name, the summary, we want to display the available actions for that given restaurant. So what can the user do to this particular piece of information? They can edit it, they can look at more details, and they can delete the restaurant. And with the MVC framework and the Razor View engine, the way to reuse this sort of markup and presentation logic is to create what's known as a partial view. Partial views are very easy to create, they're very easy to use. It's going to build on everything that you already know about Razor Views, but ultimately I want my index.cshtml view to look like the following. I still want to loop through each restaurant or each item that is in our model property. So that's going to take each restaurant out of the collection of restaurants that we have and place that restaurant into item. And then I want to invoke an HTML helper named partial. What partial allows me to do is from inside of this view, go out and say, and tell the Razor View engine, I want to render this other view. It's a partial view. It doesn't produce a full web page. It just produces a fragment of HTML, but that's okay. That fragment is going to go into this content view, which plugs into a layout view, and put all together, they do define an entire web page, including the doc type and the header and the body and so forth. But I want to go out and render a partial view, and I want the name of that partial view to be restaurant summary. I'm going to take that string and I'm going to copy that into the clipboard because we're going to use that in just a second. But this is all I need to do to render a partial view. And some partial views, that's all the information that you need to provide. But many partial views will also need a model object that contains the information that they're to place into the output. So yes, it is perfectly fine to have a partial view that just contains static information, like the address and the phone number for the company. But you're also going to have partial views that need to render a model object, like I want to use this partial view to render each restaurant in my collection. And that can be the second parameter to the partial method. So I'm going to pass along each restaurant, and this HTML.partial helper will go out and find that view, pass along the model object, render that view, and take the resulting output of that partial view and place it right here into this content view. So this is our goal, create the partial view underscore restaurant summary. Once we do that, we'll be able to delete this table, but there are some bits of information down here that I want to copy out of here first. So I'm going to leave the table in place for just now. Let's go and create our partial view. So the location where I create this partial view is very important. If I create the partial view inside of the restaurants folder, that's effectively saying, here's a partial view that I'm only going to be rendering from other views in this restaurants folder. But if I create this partial view in the shared folder, that's a way of saying I'm going to reuse this partial view from anywhere throughout the application, any other set of views that might be anywhere inside this application. Any view from any controller. I'm going to create the partial view though inside of the restaurants folder. So right click and I want to say that I want to add a view, and I'm going to paste in restaurant summary that I copied earlier. So with the leading underscore. So the leading underscore isn't required, but again, that's a convention used by MVC programmers to signify that this is a special type of view that typically isn't used to render a full web page. So we've seen underscore layout, and now we see underscore restaurant summary. That just means these views are not content views. They're special views. They're a layout view. They're a partial view. So underscore restaurant summary. I'm going to start with an empty template because we're just going to write everything from scratch. It's very easy to do. And I am going to select the checkbox here to create this as a partial view. That way, when I click add, I will create a file that isn't trying to set viewbag.title or something else that I wouldn't need in a partial view. I would need that only in a content view. Now, a partial view is exactly like any other Razor view that you might be working with. Inside of here, I can have C# code, I can have C# expressions, I can have statements, I can also have HTML markup, and I can have @model with a lowercase m to strongly type the model property that is available on this partial view. So what I'm doing from index.cshtml now is passing in each individual restaurant to this partial view. So in effect, I'm decomposing a complex model, which is a collection of restaurants, into simpler items and rendering those items with my partial view. But I am passing along individual restaurants to this partial view. So my model would be an ode-to-food.data.models.restaurant, so an individual restaurant. And now when I go to model, the uppercase M, the model property, that's typed as a restaurant, so I have access to cuisine and ID and name. But we need to display this information inside of a Bootstrap panel, which is easy to create. What I need is a div with a class of panel, and let's make it a default looking panel, so panel-default. Every panel can have a heading, which is simply a div that has a class of panel heading. And inside of that, let's place an h3 element that will display model.name, so the name of the restaurant. And I'll give this h3 element a class of panel-title. So panel default, panel heading, and panel title are just classes defined by Bootstrap to create a UI effect. And then every panel can also have a panel body, so panel-body. And every panel can also have a panel footer, but that's optional. And the heading is also optional. I'm going to leave them off. We're just going to place some content inside of panel body. And the content I want is really just the actions that can be performed on a restaurant. So let's copy the HTML helpers that create the edit, details, and delete links. Bring them over to our partial view. I'm going to paste them in here. There is one little fix-up I think I'll need, which, yes, I no longer have an item in scope, but I can just go directly to model and say this is model.id. That's the identifier I want to use for routing, so that's the link that I want you to formulate. Now let's save our partial view. Let's come back to index.cshtml. I no longer need this table, so I'm going to delete this from the UI, and I now have an index view that is relatively simple. I'm also going to delete this footer just to clean things up a bit. That was an experiment just to show you how to use sections. But I have a very simple index view. It takes a relatively complex model, which is this collection of restaurants, but I'm really delegating the responsibility of rendering an individual restaurant to my partial view. And now I can reuse and use this partial view from anywhere else inside of the restaurants folder. So anytime I want to display a restaurant summary. And now if I have everything saved and come back to the application and issue a refresh, the display might not be that interesting because we only have one restaurant in the entire database, but I do get a restaurant summary that displays the name of the restaurant in this heading area, as well as the available actions that I can take on that restaurant, like editing the restaurant. And that's an example of using partial views with the MVC framework to reuse your HTML and presentation logic. One last data structure that you might find useful inside of a view, inside of any view, layout view or content view or partial view, is a data structure known as Temp Data. Temp Data allows you to store information on the server side that will be around for one more request before it is removed. So it's very much like storing information in session state, except the information will be automatically removed for you by the MVC framework after the next request. And here's a scenario where Temp Data can be useful. So let's take the example where I go in to edit Scott's Pizza, and I just want to make a simple change. I'll change the name to Scott's Pizza 2 and click Save. And now I'm on the details for Scott's Pizza 2, so I see clearly that I have edited the name of this restaurant. But in some scenarios, that might not be enough. There might need to be some sort of explicit notification or message on this page that says, "Thank you, you have successfully saved your information." How would I pass that information from the edit action, which is really saving this information into the database, over to another request? Because remember, we send a redirect back to the browser and say, yes, you successfully performed a post operation. Now redirect over to the details view. There's various mechanisms that we could use to pass information along, including just placing some additional information in the query string, because we've already seen with the MVC model binding, we can pass information in the query string and we could pass a message along. But you have to always be very careful about passing along information in the query string that then gets echoed onto the page, because again, there's a potential for opening up vulnerabilities in cross-site scripting attacks. So let me show you how to implement this scenario using Temp Data. Let's come back into Visual Studio and come over into our controller, our restaurants controller, where we edit a restaurant. And after we successfully edit a restaurant, and before we redirect over to the details action, let's go up to our temp data data structure, and you'll see that we can work with this temp data data structure much like a dictionary. So it's a collection of key value pairs. And I can go into temp data and I can say message equals, you have saved the restaurant. And now this temp data data structure is also something I can use from a view, any view. I can use it from the layout view, or I could use it directly in this details view, because I think as long as the user has successfully edited or created a restaurant, they should be redirected to the details view. But if I go into the layout view, I can display that message after coming from any previous action or any previous view. So let's do that. Let's go over to the layout view, and somewhere here, perhaps at the top of the page before we render the body even, so let's do a check here if there is a message in temp data. So I can write an expression here. If temp data submessage is not equal to null, then I have a message. And if it's not equal to null, I want to write that message out into a user interface. So let's create a div that has a Bootstrap class of alert. And let's qualify that with alert-info. So it's an informational alert. And inside of that div, we will place temp data submessage. And now if I save my layout view, and in fact I want to rebuild the entire application with Shift-Control-B, I can now come back to my application. I want to go and edit Scott's Pizza 3. When this comes up, we will make this the 4th iteration of the restaurant and click Save. And now I can see my message appears that I have saved the restaurant. But if I come back to this page, which is the details for Scott's Pizza 4, that message is going to be gone because that entry, that message entry, is going to be removed from temp data after that request. So I can edit this restaurant as many times as I want, and that message will be in place, including the semicolon, which I always have a habit of doing this, placing a semicolon at the end of every C# expression, but obviously that's not needed inside of Razor, where you just write the expression and the semicolon is not required. And the next time I refresh this page or go to the details for Scott's Pizza 4, that message about saving the restaurant will disappear. So now you know about temp data as well as viewBag, two different data structures with two different purposes. Temp data is really about passing data between controller actions, so across requests, whereas the viewBag is really about passing data between different views that are used in the same request, so between, for example, my content view and the layout view. And we've also seen how to utilize partial views and how to have content views render into different sections on a layout view. In the next module, we're going to continue with this UI theme and talk about some of the other work that we can perform on the client using ASP.NET MVC and its associated technologies.